Welcome to Blackman Folk Tales. Kindly subscribe to our YouTube channel. Also like and share. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell, as this means the whole world to us. Lila's earliest memories were of warmth and safety, of her father's laughter rumbling through the tiny house, of evenings spent listening to his stories, and of the way her mother hummed lullabies while folding laundry. She had been a bright child, the kind teachers noticed, the one who loved books, who scribbled poems on the margins of her notebooks, and who declared with innocent certainty that she would grow up to be a writer. Her father encouraged her dream, buying her second-hand books from the market, while her mother reminded her that her words could change the world. But life has a way of unraveling dreams with cruel precision. When Lila was just 12, her father died suddenly from an illness the family could not afford to treat. His death left a hole not only in their home but in the very fabric of her world. Her mother, overwhelmed with grief and the burden of survival, grew distant, working long hours and leaving Lila to navigate her teenage years alone. The once bustling home turned silent, heavy with absence. Lila, aching for the love and guidance she had lost, drifted into a world that promised comfort but offered only shadows. By 14 she had stopped writing poetry and instead found herself on street corners with older kids who introduced her to a life she had never imagined for herself, nights filled with cheap thrills, fleeting acceptance and dangerous decisions. The bright-eyed girl who once dreamed of authorship was slowly being replaced by a young woman whose eyes carried the weight of loneliness and a need to belong. The whispers began long before Lila realized how far she had fallen. At first, people excused her behavior. She's grieving, she's just lost without her father. But as time went on, the excuses faded, replaced by judgment. She began skipping school, her grades plummeted, and her teachers shook their heads when her name was mentioned. The friends she once shared lunches with now avoided her, whispering that she was reckless, ruined, hopeless. By 16, she had earned a reputation she could not shake. One whispered in markets and muttered at street corners, "Lost." She heard the word often, though never to her face. It clung to her like a shadow, making her flinch even when she was alone. Each wrong decision added another layer to the label, and soon she began to believe it herself. The scorn in people's eyes stung less than the reflection she saw in the mirror, her once bright face now tired, her once dreaming eyes now dulled. She convinced herself that she had gone too far, that there was no road back to the girl who scribbled poems and imagined a different life. In her darkest moments, she thought of her father's voice, of the way he had told her she could be anything, and the memory only deepened her shame. She felt she had betrayed not only him but also herself. Her mother, though present in body, seemed absent in spirit, unable to pull her daughter back from the brink. Lila's world became a cycle of reckless nights and empty mornings, her heart growing heavier each day with the belief that she was beyond saving. Yet beneath the ruin of her choices, a part of Lila remained unbroken, though she couldn't see it then. There were nights when she lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling of her room, her body trembling with the aftershocks of regret, whispering to herself that there had to be more than this. She imagined the life she might have had if her father had lived, if she had stayed in school, if she had held on to her dreams. But each morning reality mocked her, neighbors who avoided her, peers who judged her, and a community that had written her off as wasted potential. Still, deep inside, like a fragile ember refusing to die out, the memory of who she once was lingered. It was this hidden ember that made her tears fall silently at night, tears no one else saw, tears that carried both sorrow and longing. She did not yet understand it, but her longing was not just for the life she had lost. It was for redemption, for a chance to prove that she was not simply the sum of her mistakes. But in this chapter of her life, that chance felt impossible. The world had branded her lost, and she had begun to wear the label like a second skin. She was the girl mothers warned their daughters about, the one whispered about in markets, the cautionary tale of what happens when grief and loneliness collide. And though the ember of hope still flickered somewhere deep within her, it was buried under so much darkness that even she doubted it could ever light her way again. The night everything began to change was one Lila never expected. She had stumbled out of yet another party, her head pounding, her body aching, and her heart heavier than ever. The streets were quiet except for the echo of her footsteps and the distant hum of a passing car. She wrapped her arms around herself, though the night was not cold. It was her shame that chilled her, a shame that seemed to seep into her bones. She paused near a small church at the edge of town, its doors cracked open, light spilling into the darkness like a beacon. Normally she would have walked past without a second thought, but something about that glow tugged at her. Perhaps it was exhaustion, perhaps desperation, or perhaps the ember inside her, long buried, had finally stirred. She hesitated at the doorway, hearing the faint sound of singing inside. The voices were not polished or grand, but raw, filled with emotion, rising and falling like waves against her heart. Against every instinct telling her she didn't belong there, she stepped inside. The old wooden pews creaked beneath her as she sat in the back, trying to make herself invisible. She wanted to leave but couldn't. For the first time in years she felt something stir within her, something she thought was long dead. As the voices swelled, tears spilled down her cheeks, and she buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly, afraid someone might see her yet unable to stop. That night was the first of many. Lila returned again and again, always sitting in the back, always trying to hide. At first, no one spoke to her, and she was grateful because she wasn't ready to explain herself, wasn't ready to confess the weight she carried. But eventually someone noticed. A woman named Ruth, older and gentle, with eyes that seemed to see beyond the surface, approached her after a service. She didn't ask questions or lecture her, she simply sat beside her, offering silent company. The next week, Ruth smiled and pressed a small notebook into Lila's hands. "For your thoughts," she whispered, as if she somehow knew that once, long ago, Lila had loved to write. That night, Lila went home, stared at the blank pages, and for the first time in years, picked up a pen. The words poured out of her like water breaking through a dam. Her pain, her regret, her longing for forgiveness, her desperate hope for a different life. The notebook became her secret sanctuary, a place where the ember inside her glowed brighter with each line she wrote. Slowly, the word lost that had haunted her began to lose its hold. She was still broken, still bruised, but she began to see that brokenness was not the end, it could also be the beginning of something new. But the journey was not easy. Every step toward hope was met with whispers of her past. Neighbors still remembered her as reckless, still branded her with the label she despised. Each day was a battle between the girl they saw and the woman she was fighting to become. Yet Ruth and a handful of others refused to let her give up. They encouraged her, reminded her that redemption was not about erasing the past but transforming it. Ruth often told her, "Your scars can speak louder than your shame if you let them." Those words echoed in Lila's heart, pushing her forward even when the weight of judgment threatened to drag her back. She began volunteering at the church, quietly at first, sweeping floors, helping in the kitchen, anything that kept her busy. And in that small space of service she found healing. Each act of kindness reminded her that she could create light even in her darkness. Her writing, once hidden, began to take shape into poems of pain and hope, words that made Ruth's eyes glisten with tears when she read them aloud. It was in those fragile beginnings that Lila discovered something powerful. Her voice, the very thing she thought she had lost, still had the power to touch hearts. And though she did not yet see it, that voice would one day carry her far beyond the small church pews where her redemption began. Years passed, and Lila's quiet transformation blossomed into something far greater than she could have imagined. The girl who once stumbled through nights of recklessness had become a woman with a story people needed to hear. Ruth had been the first to encourage her to share her writing publicly, to let her words become more than scribbles in a notebook. With trembling hands and a pounding heart, Lila agreed to read one of her poems during a small church gathering. The room was silent as her voice, shaky at first, grew stronger with each line. She spoke of grief, of mistakes, of shame, but also of forgiveness, hope, and the courage to begin again. When she finished, she expected silence, maybe polite applause, but instead she was met with tears, nods, and people lining up to tell her how her words had touched them. It was the first time she realized that her brokenness was not a chain but a bridge, that through her pain, others could find healing. Encouraged, she began sharing more, first in the church, then in community events, then online. Her words spread, carried by those who resonated with her story, until she found herself standing before crowds far larger than she had ever dreamed, her voice echoing through halls that once would have terrified her. The woman everyone once called lost had become a beacon, not because she was perfect, but because she was living proof that redemption was real. With time, Lila's influence grew beyond storytelling. She founded an organization dedicated to helping young women who had been written off by society, girls who carried the same labels she once bore, lost, ruined, hopeless. She mentored them, listened to them, and gave them a platform to discover their own voices. She believed deeply that every scar held power, that every broken story could become a testimony of strength. Her work gained recognition, attracting attention from leaders, organizations, and even international platforms. She spoke on stages where once she would never have been allowed through the door, her voice commanding attention, her presence radiating grace. Yet, despite the accolades, Lila never forgot the nights she cried herself to sleep or the moments she nearly gave up. Her past became the foundation of her authenticity, the reason people believed her when she said, "Redemption is possible." She did not preach from perfection but from experience, and that made her words resonate like fire in the hearts of her listeners. And so, the woman once condemned as lost became the voice of redemption, not just for herself but for countless others. Her name, once whispered with disdain, was now spoken with respect and admiration. People marveled at her journey, but she knew the truth: she had not saved herself. It was the ember of hope that never died, the kindness of those who believed in her when she could not, and the courage to face her brokenness that had carried her through. In every speech, every poem, every tearful conversation with a girl who reminded her of her younger self, she repeated the same truth: your past does not define your future, but it can shape your purpose. And with that, Lila's life became not just a story of survival, but of transformation. a living testimony that no one is ever too far gone to be redeemed. The woman who had once walked the streets with shame now stood on platforms with power, her voice echoing with the very thing the world had tried to strip from her: hope. Thank you for watching. Kindly subscribe to our YouTube channel for more videos, as this means a lot to us.